aligned with this privatization program, we had a complete review, a complete reform of the electricity sector framework. The idea was based on some very specific ideas. The first one was to have generation, transmission, and distribution unbundled. In order to have competition where possible, so the idea was to create a market for generation, whereas transmission and distribution that are considered to be natural monopolies by the economy would be regulated under concession agreements as public services. So the idea was to unbundle in order to enhance competition in generation and also to have a wholesale market, to have a real market to purchase and sell electricity. In order to provide for this change in the regulatory framework and also to attract private investments, it was considered to be necessary to create an independent regulatory commission. Why? Because as we saw in the first part of the presentation, delivery of electricity in general is a federal public service. So you have the federal government acting either as one economic agent that actually renders services to the market, or acting as the conceding power, one of the parts in the concession agreement. So if the idea was to attract private investments, it was thought that it would be useful to have an independent agent that, although belonging to the public administration, could have the necessary independence to rule, govern, and decide potential conflicts between the parties in a concession agreement. So, in this sense, we had ANEL being created, which is the National Electricity Agency, following some patterns that are internationally recognized to compose a real regulatory independent commission. So ANEL is an independent body. It belongs to the federal administration, but it has autonomy. It also has its main body is an office that is composed of directors that have a mandate and that cannot be dismissed during the mandate without reasons. So these persons, once they are appointed, they can only lose their terms for grounded specific reasons provided in the legislation. This is intended to provide these people with the necessary autonomy to make reasonable and grounded decisions when they face problems and difficulties in the concession agreements, in the regulation in the sector in general. It is also too important to mention that the Commission, it regulates agreements that are long-lasting agreements that last much more than one presidential office, for instance. So we created an independent regulatory commission, which is ANEL. The reform also intended to create a wholesale market to trade electricity. This, however, was not fully implemented. This trade electricity market did not manage to clearance, and we will see the reason in a few moments. It has much to do with the changes in our legal framework that resulted from the rationing period that Brazil faced in 2001 and 2002. too. And also to manage the system, the grid system, we had the incorporation of the National System Operator, which is a non-profit private association that acts by delegation of ANEL, of the Regulatory Commission, and that is responsible for managing the transmission lines, the whole grid, and also for deciding which generators will be dispatched and in which order. This is done by means of technical mechanisms and softwares, but ONS is responsible not only to manage the transmission system, but also to decide on who is being dispatched at each time. Well, so this was the framework that was going to be implemented, that was the idea that should be implemented after 1995. However, this process, it was interrupted as a consequence of the rationing period and also as a consequence of the change in the presidential and in the change of presidents that we have faced in 2003, when we have a new party assuming the most important position in the country. So let us see why this changed the idea, the first reform that was envisaged in 1995. In 2001, Brazil had to declare to be officially under a rationing period. As we mentioned in the beginning, our generation is very dependent on hydropower plants, and the country experienced a severe drought. So there was lack of sufficient generation. Besides that, there was not enough thermal capacity to meet demand. Why would be important to have thermal power plants? Because thermal power plants act as a safeguard to these occasions. If you have a complementary system of thermal power plants, once you experience a drought, you can dispatch the thermal power plants. But at that time, we did not have enough power plants, enough thermal power plants operating in order to face the drought and the lack of generation. And also, we faced some limitations in the transmission grid. The south region of the country was not a part to the rationing program. Why? Because they did not face the drought that the rest of the country experienced. However, we could not transmit the whole excess of generation that was in the south region of the country to the rest of the country. So, as a consequence of this scenario, we suffered a 9-month rationing period under which consumers were required by law to reduce their consumption. Just to give an example, if you were a residential consumer, you would have to reduce in 20% your consumption based on an average that you had consumed the year before, 3 months in the year before. And if you did not abide to the governmental program, you were subject to some consequences, especially eventually to have energy suspended for some time. So this is a trauma. I think we can say that. Yes, please.
Excuse me, Professor. The entire population, or only industries and?
No, everybody that were not resident in the south area of the country were required to participate.
It was a geographic matter, but applied to everyone.
Applied to everyone, and it applied to residential consumers and also to industrial and to commercial users. There were some differences in the rules that would apply to each to each activity, but everybody was required to participate in the emergency program for the reduction of electricity consumption. And the program was actually very successful. The Brazilian population was very adhered to the program, and as a consequence, it was not but some years later that we reached the same amount of consumption that we used to have prior to 2001 rationing period. But it was also very traumatic, and as we will see, it led to important decisions to completely change the framework of how electricity market is organized, and it led us to the second regulatory reform. So, following the end of the rationing period and the presidential elections of 2002, when the new president took office in 2003, a whole new reform was organized. First of all, privatization is suspended. So, no further privatization of generation assets, no further concessions of distribution companies. We will only continue to have concession of new transmission lines. But as I mentioned before, in the transmission segment, our concession program is to build new transmission lines. Also, if we had a rationing period, it was seen as necessary to give emphasis to planning strategy. So, we have a National Council for Energy Planning, which has powers to provide for politics not only for electricity sector but also to oil and gas industry, and these powers were enhanced as regards the electricity sector. So CNPA now has broader powers to give the drivers of our politics to electricity market. Also, the federal government decided to incorporate a state-owned company only to focus on planning, in producing studies, in producing surveys, in helping structuring the electricity auctions for generation. So we have the incorporation of EPE. And then we also have at the same time the creation of the Electricity Commercialization Chamber, which is the market operator, and who has a mandate to register long-term contracts. So the power purchase agreements must be registered with the Commercialization Chamber of Electricity. Also, as part of this reform, we have now a requirement in the legislation that distribution must be fully unbundled from generation and transmission. What does this mean? This means that a distribution company can no longer hold assets of generation and transmission. So a full unbundle of distribution. Also, this new model based on security of supply, so that we do not face rationing periods anymore. So it has emphasis in matrix diversification, and this is done mainly through two different programs of the federal government. One that started exactly the year before the rationing period, which is PPT, the Thermal Power Plants Project, which was a federal governmental proposal to incentivize thermal power plants, the construction of thermal power plants. Unfortunately, these power plants did not enter into operation in time to avoid the need of a rationing period. But since 2000, we have a federal program to incentivize thermal power plants. And also, after 2003 and 2004, we have ProInfo, which is a federal program aimed at incentivizing alternative renewable sources of electricity. So, some incentives of the federal government are given to wind power plants, to solar power plants, and also to small hydroelectricity power plants. Not the big hydropower plants, but small hydropower plants are also part of ProInfo. So aiming at giving security to the system. As hydropower is dependent on weather regimes and is subject to drops from time to time, the idea was to enhance a complementary source of energy, especially thermal power plants, that could give security to the generation of the country. Also, the legislation required a full reform of the way in which electricity will be traded in the country. So, two different environments were created. One called the regulated market and another one called the free market. And I will give you some details on that in a minute. And also, as part of ensuring that we would not face a new rationing period in the future, it was created the Committee for Monitoring the Electricity Sector, which is CMSE, which is a governmental body that is in charge of monitoring and accompanying how the sector is being developed in order to avoid further shortage of energy. So this is basically the new model of 2003 and 2004. And now we have two different environments: the regulated market and the free market. So first of all, as I told you, there was required a full unbundling between distribution and generation and transmission. So and also it was required that distributors must contract electricity through public auctions to be held by ANEEL. So distributors can no longer self-deal. I mean, they can no longer generate the electricity. They will distribute after, and they cannot sign bilateral private agreements to purchase energy. The law required that an auction system was implemented, and distributors are required to purchase 100% of their need of electricity under these auctions that are promoted by the Regulatory Commission, ANEEL. So this was to avoid the risk of distributors being short of energy. So now they must be 100% contract. They must be fully backed up of their energy needs by long-term contracts. And also, in order to incentivize distributors to be fully contracted, they must be, otherwise they may be penalized. The legislation also allowed these distributors to pass through tariff up to 103% of electricity supply. So they have to be 100% contracted, but up to 103% they are allowed to pass this cost to end users through the tariffs. This used to be 103% until this year, because now in 2013 this percentage was actually increased to 105%. Okay, so distributors as we know, as we have told before, they have some captive consumers, like residential consumers. Small consumers cannot decide from whom they will purchase electricity. They are captive consumers of the distributor. This distributor on its side must be 100% contracted. It has to be 100% contracted through public bids promoted by ANEL, and they can pass through tariff up to, now it's 105% of the cost they incur with supply. And then on the other side we have the free market. The free market is a retail competition market that only huge consumers are allowed to participate. 26% of total electricity generation in the country is traded at the free market. Who is eligible to participate in the free markets? On the consumer side, only consumers that consume more than 3 megawatts per month, or that consume over 500 kilowatts if they are going to purchase their energy through incentivized renewable sources of energy. This means that the consumers of the free market are mainly industrial and commercial consumers. And it's also important to mention that being part of the free market is an option. If the industrial consumer or this huge consumer prefers, it can be part of the regulated market. But once this consumer decides to purchase electricity in the free market, it can only go back to the regulated market by means of giving the distributor a 5-term previous information. Why is that? This is because if the distributor must be 100% contracted, it has a forecast of the amount of electricity it expects that the market will grow. So if it starts receiving many huge consumers in a short term, it can end up by not having enough electricity to distribute and be penalized by that. So why the legislation requires a 5-year term announcement? Because 5 years is the average term to build hydropower plants. So once the distributor receives the sign that it will receive a huge consumer, it can participate in the auctions provided by ANEL to the purchase of new energy, to new power plants, and then it can have a forecast of how much consumption is expected within a 5-year term. Of course, if the distributor has enough energy, it can accept the free consumer under a shorter period, under a shorter term, but it's not obliged to. It is only obliged to receive that free consumer back in the regulated market after the 5-year announcement. Okay? And of course, in the free market, the huge consumers and generators are free to trade electricity under bilateral power purchase agreements. So no auctions in the free market. Okay? As regards to transmission, the legal framework of transmission mainly says to us that the transmission of electricity in Brazil is a federal public service. Transmission lines shall be neutral in relation to generation, distribution, and end users. So you pay the transmission rate separately. These lines, how they get their revenues? They have a maximum annual revenue that is allowed, that is set by the regulator. The first price is a result of the auction for the operation, as I told you, on that auctions for the building, operating, and maintenance of new transmission lines. So you have a maximum allowed annual revenue. Once you have this revenue is supported by every participant of the central grid. Okay? And also, as I told you, we have, starting 1999, a program that is currently ongoing, nowadays, including of public bids to the build and operation of new transmission facilities. As regards delivery of energy, how energy reaches end users, dispatch is centralized and commanded by the National Operator System, which is a non-profit private association. Everybody that either produces or receives energy by means of the centralized grid must be part of this association. So at ONS we have as associates the generators, the transmission companies, the distributors, the importers and exporters of electricity, and also free consumers. And this is very interesting to notice that on the one hand, you have, as we mentioned, we have the power purchase agreements. The power purchase agreements are either a result of the public auctions, if you are a distributor and then you participate mandatorily in the regulated market, or as a part of bilateral power purchase agreements. However, the dispatch of energy follows a merit rule, which means that ONS, when deciding which generation plant is going to be dispatched, it follows merit rules. For instance, hydropower plants are usually dispatched first because you cannot stock hydropower once the water has flown through the river. It's lost, so you cannot store much of hydropower, and also because as these huge power plants in Brazil have been built long time ago, this tends to be the cheapest generation form. So we have a merit order of dispatch. Usually ONS follows this merit order, although it is allowed under exceptional circumstances to dispatch out of the merit order when it needs to secure supply. So sometimes the thermal power plants are dispatched out of merit order, but this is exceptional. But what is important to notice is that who is being dispatched is not necessarily the power plant from which the distributor or the huge consumer in the free market has actually purchased energy from. So you have the physical dispatch on the one side, and you have the commercial agreements and the financial agreements on the other side. And at the end of the day, from time to time, if these differences are liquidated. Okay? As regards to electricity price in Brazil, it is more expensive than other BRICS countries. So if you follow the prices, the average prices in 2001, you will see that Brazil is much more expensive than our friends from the BRICS. However, it is difficult, we have to say that it is difficult to compare prices of electricity due to differences in how the price is formed from one country to another, tax burdens and so on. But we have some sources saying that in Brazil we had a megawatt hour of more than 300 reais, whereas in India it was of 188 in 2001. so expensive when compared to our friends from the BRICS.
The next auction, held in August, the price will be 105.
Okay, so this is good news.
Good news.
Not to us.
I have a doubt.
Okay.
What are the most aspects that make the energy in Brazil so expensive? Because
These tariffs charged from end users include taxes and other governmental burdens that used to be responsible for more than 40% of the final price average. This is an average because one of the main taxes over electricity in Brazil is a state tax, so it varies from one state of the federation to the other, but in average we have more than 40% of the price paid by a residential end user of electricity, over 40%. So this is the main reason. And of course, this scenario is not compatible, or at least seems to not to be compatible with the principles of public service. If the delivery of electricity, if electricity distribution in the country is considered a public service, it is considered a service that has to be rendered on a universal basis and with low tariffs. And of course, high prices of energy also have impact in the industrial competitiveness. So, given this scenario, in September 2012, we experienced another change in the regulatory framework of electricity sector in Brazil. The president issued a provisional measure. Yes, to explain to our foreign friends that a provisional measure is a measure that the president is entitled to issue when there is urgency and relevance on the subject, and it is equal to a statute. However, it has to be approved by the National Congress within a certain term of time, otherwise it loses its efficacy. So, the president issued provisional measure 579, aiming at reducing 20% of the price of electricity average. Okay? What was the main changes of this provisional measure? First of all, it aimed at deciding a legal dispute that has been ongoing in the country for some time now, which was referring to some concession agreements at the generation, transmission and distribution levels that in principle would expire between 2015 and 2017. According to the Federal Constitution, as we mentioned before, the concession of public services must be preceded by public auctions. So, in principle, according to legislation in force at that time, many concessions could no longer be renewed or had their terms prorogated after 2015 or 2017. But there was some discussion ongoing as to whether the legislation would be changed or not in order to allow for another renewal. And finally, by means of this provisional measure, the president decided to allow for the renewal of many concessions under generation, transmission and distribution, provided that some requirements were met. First of all, with regard to generation concessions, the government said that if you would like to have your concession renewed, you would have now to allocate 100% of the power you generate to the regulated market. So, energy to be generated as a consequence of concession agreements that were renewed could not be traded in the free market, but would have to be fully allocated to the regulated market. Second, this electricity would no longer be part of the auctions that are promoted by ANEEL under the regulated market. Instead of having auctions, the price of electricity for each of the plants that were eligible to have their contracts renewed would be set by the Ministry of Mine and Energy based upon calculations that considered only the costs of providing electricity plus a given date of return of 10%. So we came back to a cost plus regime that used to be in place before the privatization and concession program of the 90s. So all energy to the regulated market under prices to be set by the government, and who would receive that electricity if it do not be the distributors under the auctions promoted by ANEEL? Then the provisional measure says that there will be a quota division between the distributors, which is still to be regulated, how this quota will be divided. So also prices to be set by the Ministry of Mines and Energy, and also before having these contracts renewed, the concessionaire would have to accept the governmental proposal on the indemnification for non-amortized assets. According to Brazilian law, whenever a concession is ended, the private investor is allowed to be indemnified for investments that it made with the express approval of the regulator and that were necessary to have the service being adequately delivered, and that did not have enough time to be amortized throughout the period of the concession agreement. However, the proposal of the government changed the way this price for this indemnification would be defined. Instead of taking into account the actually incurred costs recognized by ANEEL, by the regulator, it adopted another rule, which is the cost of replacement. How much would it cost to replace that non-amortized asset today? So this was the main lines of this new governmental proposal. Also, we have to say that this is all intended to reduce 20% of the final price of electricity, and in order to do that, the federal government also took out of the electricity price some of the federal burdens that incur over the electricity final price. However, this program did not make any changes in the major taxes that apply over the tariff, which are federal taxes and one state taxes, the Brazilian IVA. So the way the provisional measure was enacted, it was subject to some criticism of the market. The first criticism was lack of public discussion. I mean, it was not new to the market and to people that follow electricity sector on a daily basis, that there would be a need to decide on whether or not the concessions that were about to terminate, to expire, would or not be renewed. So the market claims that there should be opened to public discussions these proposal of the government that finally appeared by means of a provisional measure. Some say that there was breach of expectations because of the change of the way the price of generation will be defined, so no more auctions, requirement of electricity being fully allocated to the regulated markets, and prices of each power plant being defined by the government instead of the methodology we used to have, which was based on auctions. Some says that it will lead to a lack of incentives to invest, because if you only remunerate the generator for the costs of generation plus a rate of return, that there would not be incentive to invest in the expansion of the generation capacity, so that the generation market would not be much attractive in the near future. And also, some says that it led to regulatory uncertainty, because this was an important change in the legal framework of how the market is structured and how it operates, without any prior public discussions and with decisions that change some of the guidelines that were in place prior to the provisional measure. And also, one of the main points of criticism is that the concessionaires that were eligible to have their concessions renewed were required to inform the government of whether or not they accepted this offer for renewal, while the provisional measure was still being discussed in Congress and was not converted into a statute. So it was subject to changes by the National Congress. And despite the fact that it was being discussed in Congress, the concessionaires were required to make the decision of whether or not they would have their concessions renewed. So, as a consequence, we have, of course, all federal concessionaires agreeing to the renewal, because the federal concessions are ultimately controlled by the federal government. However, we had some concessionaires not abiding to the governmental proposal and preferring not to have their concessions renewed. So, as a final remark, I think we can say that, first of all, Brazil experiences a mix of public and private investments in the electricity sector, and this is very challenging to have public and private companies providing services in the electricity market. We have a very complex regulatory ambience, a very complex environment, having different frameworks, regulatory frameworks for generation, transmission, distribution, trade of electricity. And as a final remark, we must say that we are undergoing efforts to diversify the matrix with emphasis in renewable sources such as wind power, biomass, and small hydropower plants. So this is what I think this is an overall view of how electricity sector is structured in Brazil. I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.